Welcome to Automation Unpacked, Tales from the Warehouse, where we delve into the complex world of industrial automation. With insightful discussions and real-life stories from industry experts, our goal is to support, guide, and inspire you on your own journey to automate warehouse facilities. All right. Hi, Brian. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, how are you, Chloe? Great to be here.
Good. Great to have you. I am well. And just to introduce you a little bit, this is Brian Shuckle, who's our strategic account executive at SVT Robotics. And I'd love to start out by just asking you a little bit about how you got started. I know you've been in manufacturing for most of your career, and I'd love to hear a little bit about how you first got into it.
So, background is a long one. So I have a computer engineering degree. But even prior to college, I got a little bit of influence from my parents. Both my parents worked at a company called Lithonia Lighting. So while I was in high school, I actually got to intern and do some summer work at the company. And at one point, I was actually working inside of the procurement group, doing inventory purchasing for all of their supplies, right, for the manufacturing side. So that was kind of my first world into it. And then after college, I started at a company called Motivario, which is an Italian gear-based company. And I didn't realize it at the time. I thought I was just getting into inside sales, and I didn't know anything really. I didn't think about supply chain. But what it gave me a background in back then, automation in supply chain and warehousing was conveyors. So I'd go into warehouses with these giant long conveyors all over the place and sell them gearboxes. And the gearboxes were used for the electric motor. So that was kind of my real first forte into supply chain and automation. And then from there, I went to work for a company called Advantech, which is a industrial computer IoT company. And so that led me more into the world of not only manufacturing, but global supply chain, understanding real-time demand, real-time supply chain visibility, and that whole marketing world, I guess, as well. And then after a few years there, that led me to Manhattan Associates. So Manhattan Associates, I spent 15 years doing a multitude of things. I originally started as what was called a account executive for the hardware team. So I was going into warehouses and Manhattan clients and selling RF printers, wireless scales, pretty much everything you needed to run a warehouse beyond the WM. And then my role eventually moved to, I became a consultant on the hardware side, and I was architecting server solutions and deploying solutions in the warehouses, working with people around their labor initiatives, things like that. And over time, it morphed into me getting a very good understanding of data center solutions, servers, third-party software, cloud hosting, to the point that I eventually took over as what's called a technology solutions consultant on the cloud side, doing TCO model. So that gave me a real background into, we'll call it the hidden costs for supporting new solutions, software integrations between solutions, especially on a large enterprise corporate level. And then from there, I moved over to SVT.
Awesome. Yeah. So you've been around a minute.
Yeah, just a little bit.
And I'm sure you have so many stories too about how things have evolved. I mean, 15 in last, like, I mean, I've been had at 15 years, but even the last 15, 20 years, I think so much has shifted in this space. So excited to see how that plays into some of the questions I have queued up here.
Yep.
So when it comes to your role today, I would love for you to describe some of the challenges that 3PLs and large retailers are having when it comes to automating their facilities. What are those problems there, those burning, like bleeding neck problems that cause them to reach out to you?
So leading right into that, right? Great job. 3PLs and large retailers in the past have typically been very different worlds. but they're converging in today's society. And the reason for that is, you've got large retailers who, with the changing market and things like that, had fantastic supply chains that they had to build themselves in the background, because previously in the world, it was cheaper to maintain and own your own supply chain because you could do it the way you wanted it done rather than working through 3PLs. But today what they found is these large retailers understand that everybody needs that, and they can utilize that supply chain that they built and turn themselves into a 3PL. So you look at Walmart, Target, American Eagle, Gap, right? The large supply chain retailers are now looking to becoming 3PLs themselves, right? The rest of your remaining retailers are out looking at 3PLs to help them with their supply chain, because, they all have to overcome the same things in today's world, right? The world's changed. When you look at retailers today and they go look at their market, 90% of consumers expect 2 to 3 day shipping, right? And that's straight from RILA, which is the Retail Industry Leaders Association. And then 32% of shoppers, according to Shopify, that 32% say they'll just lose their cart if the shipping's not good, right? So how do smaller retailers maintain that and have a decent supply chain? They can't, right? They don't have warehouse capacity. They don't have warehouse in the right locations. They've got increased real estate costs that drive their costs up. I think real estate just in the last 2 years or 3 years is up 20% year over year in costs. So when you look at that, that makes it very difficult. Not only is it up, there's a 3% vacancy, and even in some locations, there's less than a 2% vacancy. So what that means is these retailers can't find locations all over the US to be able to meet this 2 to 3 day shipping. It just doesn't work. And because the consumer themselves, right, now is no longer going to stores, they're expecting these things shipped. So there aren't these locations to go pick it up. So they have to have increased, inbound volumes, higher inbound volumes of things coming into the warehouse to be able to save them. And these warehouses weren't built with the density that was required, right? So everybody is out looking. I think the last estimate, there was close to 700 million square feet of new warehouses being built in the US. And even with that, the next challenge has been the biggest is, even if we get the warehouse space, how do I deal with the labor, right? I can't get enough people to pick all of this stuff in my warehouse space. I've got labor costs that are increasing. I've got higher turnover, lower retention. It's I've got training time, right? So it's a difficult investment. And then, not to mention, every time I put in one of these new buildings, I'm now asking my IT group, which is already overworked, to do more, giving them less IT budget because it takes more for me to stand up the real estate and pay the employees to go in and do the work. And then from a 3PL category, I'm now also then dealing with multiple WMS vendors because they might have new clients and new buildings with a new WM. And even the WM market, I think years ago, if you looked at it when I started in Manhattan, there might have been 4 or 5 WM providers that everybody stuck with in the world. I think it, again, with cloud and with the change in the world, there is a multitude of WM providers on the market, and 3PLs are having to deal with that. And the overall rapid change of technology. Technology is changing at a pace that I don't think companies necessarily can keep up with these days.
Yeah. It's interesting about the real estate because, while there's that limited, real estate in terms of warehouse and standing up these facilities, at the same time, we have the highest vacancy in like office space, right? Like totally
Again, it goes back to people are becoming skillfully lazy, right? Like we say at SVT, right? And so they're understanding they can work from home and let other things do things for them. right?
Yep.
And I think that that also leads into the robotics world, which is if
Hmm.
I'm having labor shortages, or if I'm looking at my warehouse, where are the things that automation can do things for me instead of making the person do it? Let the person be
Hmm.
skillfully lazy, right? Let the
Yep.
person do the skill work that they can do,
Yeah.
and go from there.
Yeah. And I think that's just going to continue to increase with where AI is moving across the board. It's not, it's going to be, you know, these facilities, but then everyone that's running these facilities, what else are they leveraging, right? What other AI driven technologies will start to emerge?
Yeah,
Um,
it's crazy how fast the robotics and the automation and the AI industry, just technology in general, right? There's the old Moore's law, right, with the exponential growth of technology based on transistors, but that kind of goes across the board. The crazy part is technology is growing faster than we have people able to program.
Right. And so that leads me to my next question, right? So, for people that are maybe new to automation and what it takes to actually integrate these technologies into their host systems, um, it's important to know, and you can elaborate on this, that there is a limited number of people that actually, like, programmers that have the skill set and the background and the expertise to actually execute on these projects, right? So as the demand increases, we have all these cool tech pieces of technology, right? We were just at ProMat. It's wild. And I'm new to this particular industry, but I've been in the tech space for many years, the B2B tech space. And I just kept hearing on the floor people remark about how different things looked at these trade shows even 5 years ago. So there's this booming like amount of automation solutions out there, while we have a very limited amount of people that can do that in terms of how we integrate these solutions historically, right? Requiring custom code.
Yeah.
So would love for you to dive in and share your thoughts on that.
Sure. So you kind of hit the nail on the head, right? So going back to my world, when I worked at Motivario, I went to ProMat in Chicago, right? Very beginning of my career. That show was all about conveyors, carts, wheels, right? Push buggies. There weren't robotics. There wasn't a ton of software. It wasn't technology. It was manufacturing and mechanical and very different than it is today. And so then to your point, we go back to today, and the features of that show these days are nothing but robotics, automation, right? Like high end automation. And when we talk about the things that are going to change, I mean, they're talking about a growth in robotics, um, you know, of like, I think it's 14 or 15% over the next 10 years. And what that's going to lead to is as that robotics industry grows, somebody has to integrate those pieces, right? Somebody has to make those pieces talk to each other, which is integration. And you don't have enough people, right? So if that growth happens, we need on average about 189,000 programmers every year that would need jobs. We don't have enough college grads coming out of school with that ability to fill all of those vacancies every year to meet that need. So what that basically is telling you is what's going to happen is your integration not only isn't going to happen, it's going to become slower, but your costs are going to go higher because there's such a high demand for those programmers. Now I have to pay my programmers more to get the integrations done. So my integration costs are going to go up exponentially as well as the demand grows, if there isn't a solution.
Right. And that's not even considering what does support look like long term? How do
Correct.
we shift and adapt as the business changes need? What does that integration look like 3 years down the line, or even honestly like 6 months down the line, especially as 3PLs and their customers might rapidly change? You're having to get developers back in to adjust the custom code or custom, the integrations that they built, right?
Yeah. And again, that's standard, right? And then going back to not filling the gaps, right? You're going to have programmers who write code
Yep.
that finish the job, and then leave because they get a higher paying job somewhere else. And then nobody understands that code. Right. And companies left holding that without anyone who truly understands what was written to begin with. So that's a major issue, even in today's industry. Right.
Right.
You've got programmers that build and then leave or move on. And, what do you do with that? Especially when the market changes. And I think, again, anybody that's in supply chain or distribution in the last 3 years has seen vast changes that need to happen through the supply chain rapidly, right? We haven't seen this shift in, from brick and mortar to e-com that changed everything within the supply chain. So that alone told companies we have to be more flexible, right? We have to adapt and we have to move quicker than we have in the past. Supply chain, again, just my experience over the world, supply chain has always been that, kind of that it was there, it did what it was supposed to do. And once it was working, we didn't touch it. And that world has changed because you now need to optimize your supply chain every time there's a variance in the market. Because if you don't, you're going to get left behind. And we've seen that with company after company.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think just with the events of the last few years, I think the average person is more aware of the supply chain than they ever were before.
There are people who didn't know what supply chain was that now have questions about supply chain. Yeah. I mean, it's a growing world, right? And so, hopefully, right, people understand, and I'll say this too, when you talked about supply chain back in the day, I work in supply chain, you were either a factory worker, you were like a mechanical engineer or an industrial engineer. You weren't a computer engineer or a robotics person, right? And so that shift right there has suddenly got a lot of innovation and I won't say more intelligent, a lot of different thinking into the supply chain that we had previously. And I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. Going back to my comment, is like, I think everyone's like, it takes 6 months to get a couch. It's like, during the pandemic, it's just people were using like lawn chairs in their living room waiting for a couch. So everyone is keyed in. And I think, I would love to hear, I want to talk a little bit more, about these integrations, but stepping back a little bit, it seems like there's this shift to digitization that we've never seen before in the supply chain. And this is obviously a big part of it, right?
Yeah, I think it's a huge part. And I think what you've got is this shift to companies understanding that they have to digitize in order to move forward. Right. And so, that goes back to a lot of the reasons why companies come to SVT. So, there's other ways of doing things and the old way of doing things was very complex, which was just standard way of building integrations. But that old way was also very rigid, right? So the old method was APIs and wasn't even APIs. It was point-to-point integrations that APIs were supposed to solve, where everybody was supposed to write a standard and then people could meet it. But the idea is everybody writes their own standard, so it really didn't do anything. But it's a complex task where you had to have people sit in the room, you go back and forth, and anybody that's ever worked at a large company, right? You sit in a room and you have a meeting for an hour and you get like 2 things accomplished, right? And you reconvene to the next week and you get another 2 things accomplished. And then you reconvene for another week or 2 weeks, right? Because people have vacation. You can't meet next week. So you meet the week after. So it takes projects, months and months and months for people to resolve things that should be done much quicker. And so I think everybody understood that, right? And then people started building products for that digitization, right? So there are products out there like an iPaaS product like MuleSoft or Boomi, that basically says, hey, just your developers can just quickly write their own APIs, which is great. But again, it goes back to what APIs are you writing? How are you writing those APIs? What are you matching against? And then it's a specific set of APIs once again, right? You're not actually making that generally useful. It's a specific set of APIs for the task that you're building to. So, the issue with that is excuse me, the issue with that is in today's world, if I have to make changes to that, once again, I've got to have a developer come in, make those changes. But if I want to change any of my endpoints on one side or the other, it becomes very difficult.
Yeah.
Right. And with again, the rapid, and always evolving business logic in today's world, like we talked about, that suddenly I need to be able to switch which warehouses I ship from or which products are more viable in today's world than other ones. Um, it's a big deal when you talk about it. And that's, excuse me, that's where SVT kind of comes into play. So what SVT does is we offer a low code product. That means you don't necessarily need a developer, but other people can learn it as well. It offers rapid deployments. We have pre-built softbot connectors, leading the industry with 90 plus execution technologies. And then that gives you visibility for support, single pane of glass, decreasing time to resolution, which decreases costs within the environment. And one of the bigger ones that I've seen recently is it gives you real-time decision based on business logic for orchestration in the integration, right? So a little more background into what that means. Typically integration was, I sent this data gets passed to these other endpoints. And that's all it was. What we really need, and this is even from Gartner, right? Gartner even says the world today, you have to be able to take all of that and make real-time decisions. And I think I got a quote I can probably say on it in a minute, but being able to do that in real time is a true game changer for SVT. And it goes beyond just automation, right? Bringing in desperate subsystems that have all of the data that you need, right? So it's not just system to system, but it's across the enterprise taking bits of data, because data is the world these days, taking that data and being able to make business logic decisions within your supply chain, and orchestrate that.
Yep.
And then the last one is SVT, allows clients to have best of breed for solutions, right? So, and that's really saying, I don't have to go wait for one vendor that does my palletization, that does my truck unload, that does my picking, that does my transport tasks, that does my put away, right? I can actually go find best of breed of those individual parts, and really allow them to focus in on what they do best, and then have SVT orchestrate all of that, which that just wasn't possible in the past, or really becomes very difficult if you use a standard integration method.
Absolutely. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about, and perhaps you have some examples you can share. You're talking about these softbot connectors, reusable components that help you connect, host systems with an OEM's solution. And it's reusable, it's flexible, all that good stuff. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the risks associated with these massive automation projects to begin with. Like these are not cheap endeavors. And obviously historically they've taken a really long time. So I'd love to hear some stories you might be able to share about sort of in the traditional approach or traditional options for standing up these solutions, what that's looked like and what it looks like when it doesn't go well, right? Like what are those risks, and tease that out a little bit for us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it goes back to my previous life experience, right? When you were talking to clients about changing their WM, again, supply chain is everything for these companies, right? If the supply chain is broken, they're not making money. So when you talk about making major changes like this, whether it's a WM change or it's fully automating a facility and doing massive automation, they're what we call C-level killers, right? So what that means is that C-level person is making a decision for that corporation or that company, that if it goes wrong, they probably don't have a job after that happens, right? So when you talk about automation projects, require a significant amount of time in the past, strictly because of the aspect of it's a black walled garden that somebody comes in and it's very strict and rigid. This is the way we're going to go from point A to point B. And then from point B to point C, it's going to do this, or we can go to point D, and everything has to be designed out of the gate with every possible exception scenario worked out ahead of time, because once it's built, right? Once that automation is in place, I can't handle an exception, right? If that exception wasn't worked out to begin with, I don't know what to do with it. So, that's always been the difficult part with automation. And once it's in, getting that exception taken care of by a vendor typically is extremely expensive, right? So we're talking in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for somebody to go back in and reprogram PLCs to put in a new sensor here, change a direction there. And it's just, it has not been something, especially when you look at today's world, but the smaller retailers and the 3PLs have really invested in. It's been your much larger retailers that have very specific facilities that they know are going to process in a very specific manner, and that's not going to change. When you look at 3PLs, that's just not the world they live in, right? They're changing customers, they're changing products, they're changing workflows. And so they have to be able to do that on the fly. So these large automation solutions always, aren't necessarily the best choice for them. And those like
right. And to that end, particularly for 3PLs, but for really any business, you mentioned finding like the best in breed solutions to meet those business needs. They're going to change. So you might come to the table with a few different brands, right? Obviously, right, to optimize different workflows. How do you manage, like, how does the platform manage that? I know it's tech agnostic, but can you talk about how that actually works?
Sure. So SVT software platform, right, is fully agnostic to the different brands of robotics, right? So when we talk about trying to take different vendors, right, it's like putting a square peg into a round hole, but every time you add in a vendor, you add in multiple integrations. And what SVT does is says, we take data from all the endpoints, and rather than everybody talking to each other, we have a data normalization layer that we call our domain events. And everybody talks to those common domain events. And then all they're doing is publishing and subscribing data into those domain events. So it's like if you were speaking French and I was speaking Spanish and there was another English person speaking in the room, we wouldn't have a very good conversation, right? This wouldn't happen today. But if I'm able to talk through an avenue where everything that I say gets converted, and then you don't hear anything back but French, right? So you hear exactly back what you want to hear, and everything that you say then gets converted and talks into the middle. And then that is converted and sent back to me in Spanish and vice versa. So the idea here is it's almost like a universal translator that sits in the middle. But above and beyond that, what you oftentimes have is I have words in my language that don't make sense in your language, right? Or vice versa. So what SVT can do in the middle as well is I can actually interrogate me or what I'm saying, and I can manipulate the words back to you so it makes sense to you in French, right? So again, same idea here where I might not have, from a WM perspective, I might not have the ability to send a certain set of data. So rather than trying to teach that WM how to send it or get a developer to write that code, SVT can interrogate that data and go, hey, I need this additional bit of information to pass it on to this execution tech. And we can actually create that in our layer before we send it on. So now what I've done is I've taken technical debt off of the WM provider and I put that into our layer. But I can even write business logic that says, hey, he was saying something back, but it doesn't need to go to that person. It needs to go to the other person, right? So now I know who exactly I'm sending the data to and what data they need. So looking at the data, how it's sent, I can interrogate where it goes, and I can orchestrate who's having the conversation. So all three of us might not be having a conversation at once. It might just be me and you and me and another person, but that's what SVT can do in the middle.
That makes sense. And to clarify, that means that the OEM partner is able to communicate essentially with all these other partners without them changing their technology, their API at all.
You are dead on, right? So when we talk about our OEM vendors and the 90 plus connectors that we've got pre-built, what we do is we go to those vendors and we're like, look, you just give me the language that you're talking in. Give me your APIs. I don't need you to change. I'm just going to take that and I'm going to convert that into our domain events.
Mm-hmm.
So they're already talking to my layer, right?
Yep.
So from an integration perspective, what that does is that decreases the time now. Now I don't have to have vendor and vendor saying, you have to change the way you talk so that we can talk to each other. I just go to all the endpoints and I simply say, I don't care how you get me the data. I'll convert it into my domain events and my domain base. And then everybody can publish and subscribe. So those endpoints now are standardized. So the support for those partners stays standard. They're not doing custom integrations for every single client. And again, I'm decreasing the amount of time because as I have those standard connectors, I'm only working on one side and I'm not asking for a lot of changes from either of the sides. So that gives SVT the ability to get integrations down to that 10 to 12 week time frame versus the 12 to 16 months time frame that you're looking at with standard integrations.
Yeah, that's a big difference. And again, with reduced risk, right? So it's like
risk
and flexibility long term and scalability, right?
Absolutely.
Because those components are reusable. I would love to hear, before we close out this part, I would love to hear you give maybe a specific example of that orchestration capability that the platform can support. Like, what are some common use cases you see pop up where that's leveraged?
Sure, absolutely. So there's multiple ways that what we use, we call it soft bot orchestration, right? So great example would be, we had a client running more picking bots, right? Locust Robotics. And what they found was they hadn't slotted their facility. And slotting is when you put items in certain rows, right? So that you're picking. And the Locust robots were getting very congested during peak season. And so they weren't getting a good ROI or performance out of the Locust bots because they couldn't just get through the aisles. And so what we were able to do is go through and actually build an orchestration that took their fastest movers during peak season. And rather than, again, sending that data to Locust, SVT was able to send that data to a put wall and a pick to light wall. And so we were actually able to pick to light those fast movers, pull them out of the aisles with Locust. So Locust just did the rest of them, but then created that orchestration so that those items were picked from pick to light, the rest of the items from Locust. And because our orchestrations are what we call microservice based, or the soft bot connectors, they're actually able to do it seasonally, right? So they can pull in and drag out those orchestrations as needed, which is another big part of the SVT ad with the orchestrations, right? Is it doesn't have to be that way all the time. I can actually do it for periods of time. Another great example is client had a WM that couldn't do super singles orders. A super single is a single item, single line, single SKU. And SVT came in and said, instead of trying to fix the WM to make that work for now, we'll interrogate the data. And if it meets all of those parameters, we will actually add that code before we send it to down to Locust. I think it was Locust in that case, and be able to handle it from there. Now, the great part again with that is, and this didn't actually happen, but it could have, is if they had upgraded their WM to a different WM, or even an upgraded version of the one they had that had that capability, I can now remove that orchestration. Again, we can fill gaps and we can do orchestrations and we can do work that WMs or ERPs or the other host systems don't have the capability of without putting that technical debt on those products.
Makes sense. And I think that that's a good segue into one of the questions I had was, um, what happens if a customer is in that sort of phase where they know they need to or plan to upgrade their host systems, and they might be hesitant to embark on, an automation initiative because, they're going to have to like, oh, what will I have to redo everything, right, with the new system or, the new version. Could you talk me through sort of your experience and how customers have handled that and what their options are from a integration perspective?
Yeah. So I think, like I mentioned earlier, right, those WM upgrades, right, or company killers and things like that, and customizations within WM in any software product, making upgrade much more difficult, right? So what that tends to do is it leads clients to sit on the versions of their software for like 8 to 10 years. So even my time at Manhattan Associates, right? There are clients that are still running what is called PKMS, which is like Manhattan's very first product, which is like 30 years old at this point. And so they're sitting there because they customized it and they don't want to port those changes and they don't want to move off of it. Right. So Manhattan doesn't like it. It's out of support. They'd rather them be on the newer version. Support costs less. Um, but what you have is every time you build one of those customizations or an integration into that system, it's point to point, and that has to be ported to the next version. And so the WM providers, all of the WM providers across the industry have gotten to the point where they can no longer take on this technical debt. And they've all said, we want to move towards having a standard version that we move forward. And the reason for that is they just can't continue to support. And that even goes for the execution text. All of these vendors are saying, we want to stick with our standard APIs. We don't want custom APIs. It becomes too difficult to manage and maintain. And so what SVT does, it gives you that ability to, pre-build softbot connectors to not only those host systems, but to those vendors, and allow that product to be quickly integrated, rapidly integrated, right? And give that flexibility and choice. So again, as I'm upgrading, great example, we had a client that was on one WM vendor. They wanted to put in automation, but they wanted to wait a year and a half until they finished their WM upgrade. With SVT, what we were able to do is say, take advantage of the automation now. We'll build that connector to the existing WM. But because it wasn't a costly point-to-point integration, a year down the road, we were able actually to pull out the old WM connector and drop in the new WM connector with the automation not having a clue. Nobody from the automation vendor had a conversation with the WM provider about building the integration, and overnight changed their WM within the warehouse. The warehouse people didn't even realize it necessarily, other than the screens changed on some of the user stations. So that's the power of SVT and the SoftBot connector.
Great. And when should people start automation projects?
Early, and now, right? In today's world, right? Start now and start simple. I think the issue that you have in the industry today is people are afraid to start automation because they think automation projects are big and scary and high integration. And if I'm going to automate and do an integration now, I want to do this automation later. So I got to do it all at once. So I'm not paying multiple integrations. And really, I think the way they need to look at it is start now and start small, right? So digitize first, deploy smaller, and deploy faster. And with SVT, what that does is it lowers the risk. It gives you better ROI on each of the products. So I'm not lumping IoT in with AMR picking or AGV picking or AGV transport tasks. right? I can do very simple IoT type integration, even if I'm doing something as simple as just taking measurements to give myself better visibility into my warehouse with IoT, to then taking that into, now I have measurements. Now, how do I execute something off of those measurements, right? Whether that's how often does a trash can get emptied? Do I have the ability then to have that trash can picked up by an AMR and taken away instead of paying an employee to do that? Can an AMR do that? How often am I doing cross docking, right? Can I look at how often pallets or how long pallets are sitting in my dock before they're moved across? And can I get the ROI out of an AGV moving that throughout the facility rather than having labor do that? So again, all of that leads into digitizing first, which is simple as taking my WM or my host system and building a softbot connector to it and putting that data in the platform. Again, I talked about data is everything. If I have that data in that platform, that is now visible to me. I can now take that data and access it from a BI or even from a great partner like Versus.ai and allow the AI to actually manipulate and look at that data and answer questions for me about what's happening in my warehouse that I might not have seen previously. So that's a big part of starting the automation project. I think a lot of people, again, think I've got to do it all at once. You can do it component by component and take it in smaller steps. I think you're going to get a lot more acceptance, not only from the executives within a company, because it's lower risk from a cost perspective. You're going to get a lot more acceptance from the labor, because that's been a big problem with the labor is I don't want robots. Robots are taking everybody's jobs. What they need to understand is I don't want robots aren't taking their jobs. I want the robots to do the things that people can't do, because robots still today and automation today can't do everything that people can do. And that goes back to the skillfully lazy. Let the people do the skillful jobs, right? Make them feel good and useful, and let the robots do the tasks that robots can do, which is just move product from here to there.
Right. And it's, I think we hear about like lights out facilities, and it's like, that's probably not going to happen
No.
with most businesses anytime soon. So there's so many sort of steps and stages between that that very much involve people. I would love to hear, as you're having a lot of conversations with, retailers, 3PLs looking to automate. I'd love to hear some of the like attributes or sort of elements in those engagements where you're like, they know what they're talking about. They're going to be really successful. What are those people coming to the table with, having thought through? Could you describe to me what that looks like? I think it might be helpful for people that are new and are like, all right, what sort of ducks do I need to get lined up before I, dive into some of these conversations?
Yeah, so it's been different. It varies from company to company, depending upon the companies. I think a lot of companies that you see these days are building their own, call it innovation teams, to go out and look how they actually continue to innovate, especially across the 3PL market. I think DHL has kind of driven kind of that path. And I hate using the A word, but Amazon is kind of like the golden child of this world, right? Everybody's trying to follow what Amazon does. But when you talk to companies and they start and you have people that understand that they have to automate, I think number one biggest conversation with people is when you're in a room and they understand that automation is an inevitability, not a nice to have. The conversation moves a little quicker, right? When you're talking to people and they think, oh, well, I don't have to do that today. It's a little harder conversation. But again, it's above and beyond automation. It's the conversation of what I do with all of my data and how I make better decisions in the warehouse. and how people understand that it's not just an integration of sending data to a particular device. It's how do I get all of the data and make real business decisions off all of that data, and then orchestrate that automation, right? So that's the bigger, when you get a client who gets that says, hey, now if I could suddenly take all of my data mapping of where my product is, how often it's picked, who's picking it, how often they're picking it, where it's going, what they're picking it with, how often that machine is used. And then I can actually orchestrate all of that data from IoT, from other subsystems, right? From other providers, and bring all of that in, use that to create business logic to orchestrate. I think that's the key. And the people that get that, immediately lights are going off in their head when we're having conversations.
Right. Yeah. It's not, oh, great, we have a lot of data. It's, is it intelligent? Can we make it intelligent? And then can we actually take action?
Correct.
What's one thing that surprises people when they learn about SVT, or really just about automation and what it takes to actually stand it up?
So about SVT, I think a lot of people have the misconception that SVT is just an integration platform. And we are quite a bit more than just an integration platform. In a real world example, I was sitting in a meeting with 20 plus executives, and we were talking about some of their issues within their warehouses. And I brought up and pitched an idea of using the platform to take data from multiple subsystems in ways that they hadn't thought of, and give them access to real-time visibility into some of their labor force. And light bulbs just went off. I mean, again, it was you can do that. And the answer is yes. And again, it's because of that domain model that we have and the ability to take data and put it into our system and aggregate that data across multiple disparate systems. And so it was a change, because their viewpoint of integration was, I have to go from system to system, system to system, system to system. And with SVT, I made it very clear, I don't have to start at the end. I can go all the way back to the beginning and take data from there, and then take data from the next step, and then take some data from the next step. And then I can bring all of that in, and I can merge all of that important data that you mentioned before, right? Where is that vital data that I can make decisions off of, and merge it all together? Because again, previously in the world, everybody they have to go look at one subsystem and they'll log in and create a report. Then they have to go look at another subsystem on the other side and create a report. And then somebody's creating an Excel spreadsheet in the background that merges both of those reports, right? And then somebody's making a decision off of that. What if I could take all of that data into a singular location and make decisions off of it? That's kind of the eye opener for a lot of people from my perspective.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It makes me think about how, across all, industries, like this is a massive problem. How do we take data from disparate systems and make it make sense and make it help the business, right? Inform their decision making. And yeah, it's quite a game changer. And I think that historically, or at least in my experience, it's like, okay, great, we can pull in data from these different systems, but then the data is like, it's not mapped. There's different definitions. It's really hard to reconcile and provide value. And what I'm hearing from you is not only are we pulling this data in, but it's already mapped, and because within the platform, we're standardizing that communication, right?
Correct.
So is it fair to say that when that output is going to be like, that will be standardized?
Correct. So somebody on the other side of all of that data with a business intelligence tool or even an AI tool could come in and already know all of that data, how they are intertwined, right? And how that looks together. And then what business decisions do I need to make off of it? Am I just reporting off of it? Or do I need to send it to another piece of execution tech to do something specifically because I have these particular attributes, right? So all of that is kind of the power of the platform.
Absolutely. All right. So, any other advice you would give folks embarking on their automation journey before I let you go? Anything else? Last words?
You know, my biggest thing is automation. Automation and integration doesn't have to be that complex. I think people in today's world make it out to be time consuming and painful. Um, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. And from the other piece of it is, you know, from an IT organization, don't fight with your ops people because you all oftentimes get operations people fighting with IT. Operations want something, IT says no, it's too difficult, or I've got to do this other project. Um, but if you could give them a tool like SVT SoftBot platform, right, that not only they could build, but they can support and enhance and help the operations team, and even have the operations team assist in supporting IT is huge, right? And again, it's about not waiting and digitizing first, and even starting that process smaller, right? So I don't need to throw everything onto ops at once or everything onto IT at once, right? Start smaller and then move faster, right? I think we all know we have to do this and it's coming. And I think if we wait to if you look at everything we've talked about today, from real estate to labor to the shortage of developers, right? If you wait to try to do this all at once, one, you're not going to find the real estate to put a brand new warehouse in and put in a full set of automation. I don't have the developers to build the code right now to get that done in time to get anything productive out of it, right? So how do I do it? Take your existing locations, get it done smaller, get it done faster, easier support, right? And have that tool set, which is SVT softbots. I think that's the way to go in today's world.
Makes sense. Iterative process. All right. Thank you so much, Brian. It's been a pleasure. And we'll talk soon.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Chloe. Talk to you soon.
Cheers.